And welcome to the final studio edition of Gridiron Nation on TSN. He is Gord in Studio Land, and I'm Jim on Football Island. Now, usually, this is where we go to the stateside five, but we are going to go through the top 5 players selected for the Cornish Trophy. Let's go to the first in alphabetical order. Elic Ayomanor, a junior wide receiver at Stanford, showcased steady production amid a challenging 2024 campaign for the Cardinal. Hailing from Medicine Hat, Alberta, Ayomanor's discipline, route running precision, and ability to fight for extra yards emerged as bright spots on a team that struggled to a 3-9 finish. Last year's Cornish Trophy winner, Ayomanor secured 63 receptions, surpassed 800 yards receiving, and notched 6 touchdowns. He proved especially adept at finding space against tight coverage, turning short and intermediate routes into productive gains. His reliability on third downs and knack for making contested catches established him as the go-to target in the passing attack. Ayomanor's performance earned him recognition within the conference and beyond. Touted by Pro Football Focus for his solid route-running skills, he also drew attention from observers north of the border who praised his progress as a prominent Canadian talent destined for the National Football League. In 2024, Elic Ayomanor stood as testament to perseverance, skill, and consistency. So there he is, last year's winner, Elic Ayomanor of Medicine Hat, Alberta. Gord, he was productive, he was consistent. He probably got the year that he wanted if he's deciding to go into the NFL draft, even though the numbers in terms of total yards weren't all that dazzling.
Yeah, I mean, I think that he put a lot of good stuff on tape with an eye to the next level if that's what his plans are. He doesn't break the 1,000-yard barrier this year, but realistically, the difference between this year and last year for him was he just didn't have that nuclear game like he had in that infamous Friday nighter against Colorado last year, where he just absolutely went off. But if you go week by week outside of that game this season, it more or less lines up. And this was on a Stanford offense that did not pass the ball effectively at all season long. Even when they were at their best, Ashton Daniels was more of a run-heavy type of guy on offense. So he was doing about as much as he possibly could on what was a bad offense and a bad team. So I think that he had a really good year, though, in terms of when that offense was on the field, he was very clearly the guy. He drew a lot of attention for defensive secondaries, ended up having to catch a lot of contested balls, and did so quite effectively in a lot of cases. There are numerous times that I remember watching some film on Stanford this year and having a situation where everybody in the building knew that Ayomanor was going to be the focus, and the ball went to him anyway, and he still managed to battle and come down with that ball more often than not. And that really is a testament to how his abilities have evolved, and I think that that's something that NFL teams are going to love on tape, again, if that's what his intention is to take that next step this offseason.
How did defenses prepare for him this year the way that they didn't in the previous year?
I mean, I think we started to see this towards the tail end of last year, but certainly throughout this season, you saw a lot of rotation of coverage, right? And I did mention this on the program a few weeks ago, but not necessarily bracket coverage, which is your kind of traditional double team coverage where you have a low man, a corner usually, and a safety over the top who are man dedicated to Ayomanor. That doesn't really happen that much in the modern age. What you do see more of, though, is you see zone coverage shells that are rotated towards that side. So say you have a 2 high safety shell. Well, it's actually going to be kind of a 1.5 high safety shell in that the 2 deep zones are going to rotate over to that key receiver side and make sure that the extra body is always over top of where the key receiver is. And you saw a lot of that when watching Stanford with Ayomanor this year. And that what that does is that means that he kind of has to live in the short to intermediate, or he has to live in that little tiny tunnel between the sideline and the numbers and make a lot of his hay there. And that just limits a lot of the field for him. So it just makes his life so much more difficult. And you saw that in what he was able to produce this year, is that more contested balls, much more tight window stuff, and him having to just basically work harder for what he got.
Now let's go to our second Cornish Trophy finalist under the B. Ty Benefield, a sophomore safety from Vancouver, BC, emerged as a linchpin in Boise State's remarkable 2024 campaign. a season that culminated in the Broncos securing a coveted berth in the college football playoff. After stepping into a far more prominent role than his freshman year, Benefield's leadership, on-field awareness, and knack for dissecting offenses helped galvanize the Broncos' defense into one of the nation's most formidable units. Statistically, Benefield's numbers underscored his importance. Through the regular season and conference championship, he racked up 73 total tackles, collected multiple pass breakups, hauled in 2 interceptions, forced a fumble and recovered another 2. His range and closing speed enhanced Boise State's coverage schemes, while his willingness to crash downhill against the run helped stifle opposing ground attacks. With Benefield's steady hand in the secondary, Boise State kept an undefeated run through the conference, rose into the top echelon of national rankings, and earned its first ever spot in the CFP. As they prepare to face college football's elite, the Broncos know their rising Canadian star is ready to shine under the brightest of lights. So he is a native of Vancouver. He holds dual passports, came out of Irvine, California, Ty Benefield. And if you talk to his father, David, well, he'll tell you that Ty is still committed to Boise State. But man, could this guy enter in to the transfer window and find himself with a larger program than Boise State? And that's saying something considering how the Broncos played this year.
I mean, he could, and you know, our guest Farhan Lalji alluded to this on last week's program that, you know, he was pleasantly surprised that he didn't make any kind of a jump in the portal last year, and I would suspect that interest, the sniffing around, probably the tampering at this point, is probably already occurring. I mean, more and more this year we've actually heard rumblings of that occurring with key players. It would not surprise me if Benefield's among those as a true sophomore, a guy that has firmly established himself as a regular contributor on defense, over 70 tackles this year, 5 tackles for a loss. He's a real presence on top of that Boise defense that has done an excellent job throughout the season. You know, it's a lot of people like to discount Boise's schedule because they were in the Mountain West Conference, but let's not overlook the fact that they did play the number 1 team in the country in non-conference play. And yeah, that was early in the season, and Idaho played them tight too, and whatever. But the fact of the matter is, one of the best offenses, the best team right now in the country, and Boise lost that game, but kept a lid on it, right? Kept them into the 20s, lost that game by a field goal. Benefield was a big part of that. And when you saw what they did in the conference championship game against UNLV, which was also another very high-powered offense throughout their year, you know, they just completely put the clamps on them. Benefield was fantastic this year, and he was outstanding as a freshman last year. This year, he was just outstanding, period. And I thought that his performance continued to improve throughout the year, culminating in that conference championship game last week. And that's nothing but good news. But when you talk about the bigger picture of the transfer portal, you know, Boise State, I can't speak to the financing going on inside their program and how they're doing it, but they, with Ashton Genty having stuck around in the program, have a pretty good record of keeping guys in the program that they really want to keep in the program. So I would, at least at this point, all signs point to him staying at Boise State next year. And frankly, with the success that team has had on the field, I don't necessarily blame him. Like, I get that the payday is tempting to go to maybe one of the big time schools, but if you're talking pure football output, Boise State has been a big time school for the last decade plus. And so it's not the worst case scenario to stay there, stay at a market that is within a long drive, but a drive of home, and stay in a place that's comfortable and where you've had success.
What is the strongest aspect of Benefield's game? And you know what? It is really hard to believe that this kid is a pure sophomore right now when you look at his game.
Yeah, it is. I think where I find myself most impressed by Benefield is I think that he's got really advanced instincts for a guy that is just a 20-year-old sophomore at this point in time. He always seems to find himself in the right position on the field. He is rarely caught out of position in coverage. And so, you know, he can come and clean things up. He's a good tackler. He's not a play at the line of scrimmage guy most of the time, but as noted, you know, had 5 tackles for a loss this year. He can come up and make those plays if he needs to, but he also plays center fielder more often than not for Boise. And he's a guy that kind of covers for other teammates where they are potentially beat. And that, for me, is the thing that stands out most for me, is that, you know, and I will say too, Canadian guys tend to stereotypically be stereotyped as being kind of lacking in this area, deficient in this area, because of the relative lack of football reps they have compared to guys growing up in the States. And for Ty, I think it's doubly impressive that those are the things that jump off the page is those instinctual things where he just understands the game. And he's a legacy of a professional player as a father and all those kinds of things. So I don't want to downplay that by any means, but I think that makes it even more so impressive that that's where the strength of his game lies.
Let's stay on the defensive side of the ball with our number 3 selection. Dariel Djabome, a sophomore linebacker at Rutgers and a native of Longueuil, Quebec, made waves as a key defensive contributor throughout the 2024 season. Stepping confidently into a starting role, Djabome's blend of athleticism, field vision, and vocal leadership helped guide the Scarlet Knights to a 7-5 record and a much-anticipated bowl berth. His unrelenting motor and ability to read developing plays were catalysts in steadying a defense eager to climb the Big Ten ranks. His numbers tell a compelling story. Across the regular season, Djabome registered 102 total tackles, while also posting a handful of sacks, a pair of forced fumbles, and excelled in both run-stopping situations while dropping into coverage, showcasing the versatility modern defenses demand. Is Longueuil, Quebec's Dariel Djabome the biggest surprise of this year for you? He's certainly one of my top 3 surprises in terms of his performance and how he stepped up. But if you ask the people around Rutgers, he didn't surprise anyone.
I mean, he may not have, but from the outside of that program, it far and away a surprise. I mean, this is a guy that was barely on our radar when we opened the season up. We knew that he was there, right? We track all the Canadians that we can find in the NCAA, but he was not a guy that we intended to talk much about this year. Even within that Rutgers roster, when we were talking about guys to talk about, we were talking about Wesley Bailey first and foremost, who was quiet this year and actually has just transferred out and transferred to Louisville instead. Djabome, meanwhile, just absolutely hit the rocket strip this year. And it was about week 3, I recall, that all of a sudden I went, oh, this Djabome guy just recorded like 12 tackles this week and a tackle for a loss. Like, those are some great numbers. And then he just started stacking that week after week after week. One of 2 inside linebackers that did a lot of the tackling work in that Rutgers defense throughout the season. And he was fantastic, showed some chops in coverage as well. The athleticism for him to move sideline to sideline was particularly impressive. And I think also beneficial for him is that he was part of a Rutgers team that is really on the rise right now. Like, Greg Schiano has come back from his flirtation with the NFL and has reestablished himself very quickly at that program and put Rutgers back in a competitive mode, which he's basically been the only coach to do that in the last number of decades for a program that has often been a bit of a punching bag. But Schiano seems to have the magic formula, and Djabome's been more than happy to be one of the leaders pushing things forward for that program.
When we come back, we'll go with number 4 and number 5. Stick around. Welcome back, everyone, to Gridiron Nation. We're going over the top 5 who qualify for the Cornish Trophy this year as the top Canadian in the NCAA. We left off at number 3. Let's roll into number 4, and we've got another defensive contender. Jett Elad, a senior safety at UNLV, continued to distinguish himself as one of the most impactful Canadian players in collegiate football in the 2024 season. Hailing from Mississauga, Ontario, and now in his second year with the Rebels, Elad's leadership in the secondary helped power the team to a 9-3 record and a spot inside the nation's top 25 rankings. For the second consecutive year, Elad earned a spot as a Cornish Trophy finalist, solidifying his status as one of the top Canadian talents in NCAA football. So it's another strong safety from the Mountain West. If you look at them numbers-wise, whether it's PFF or whether it's straight stats, Jett Elad and Ty Benefield, you could probably sneak a sheet of paper in between these two in terms of performance. But Elad's a senior. He's a super senior that transferred over from Ohio a couple of years ago. This is his swan song. Tell me what you thought about his final season in college football.
I thought it was a really important season for Jett Elad to truly establish himself at this level. We saw him start to make a bit of an impact with UNLV last year. You probably heard his name bandied about on this program last season, but he was kind of a part-time rotational guy. So he would have some weeks where he would be prominent, and he would have some weeks where he wasn't really a factor at all. And this year, he stepped himself into a position where he was a prominent member of that defense every single week out, was producing every week, and was a guy that if you watched UNLV play, was prominent on the field as well. And so I think he set himself up really well for that step to the next level. And good for him. It's been a bit of a circuitous route to success for him since going south of the line. You alluded to the fact that he had to transfer to get to UNLV, and he took a pretty significant risk in transferring to UNLV. When he went into that program, it was a program under a new coaching staff that had been not winning hardly at all the previous number of years. And he kind of took that leap of faith, and he ended up being one of those guys that came in from outside and helped really elevate this program to a Mountain West title contender. So I think he's got a lot to be proud of in his career on the whole. And what I found most impressive for him this year is he was a guy, and you alluded to the fact the stat line looks almost exactly the same as Benefield. I do still think there was a bit of a different style between the two of them. Elad was a guy that was a little bit more up around the line of scrimmage, a little bit more of a run support oriented safety for most of the season, and a little bit less of a center field lurking around, go pick off balls type of guy. Only the one interception on the season is not going to jump off the page, but 73 total tackles for him is excellent. And I think that it was a big step forward for him to prove that he's a legitimate, consistent defensive starter at this level that can be a good, positive player on a good defense.
He scores well in pass rush as well, and I'm thinking that translates to a good CFL career for this guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, if you're projecting him to the CFL, he's a guy that I would like to see jump into that Sam position or the boundary side halfback spot. Both are spots that are, I mean, Sam is nominally a linebacker position, but in the Canadian game, it's effectively a defensive back. He may need to fill out a little bit to do that. He reminds me a little bit actually of Enoch McConzo, who came out of Coastal Carolina a few years ago, and he's yet to really take off in this DFL, but same type of skill set, and I think fits in a similar vein in the CFL in that way as a position that can kind of lurk around the edge of the box, can be brought to pressure the passer if you want to get exotic with things, but also is primarily going to be a secondary guy, drop back in coverage, clean stuff up in the open field, that type of stuff. So I think for me, that's where the projection is for Elad if you're looking at the CFL prospects.
So you've got Benefield, you got Djabome, and you've got Elad. Who is your favorite of those three defensive players that are up for the Cornish Award this year?
For me, it's far and away Dariel Djabome, and that's not to take anything away from the two defensive back guys, but maybe I'm just kind of romanticizing the story, but as far as I'm concerned, Djabome came basically out of nowhere and became a dude this season, racking up the tackle numbers, flying all over the field, making plays in all sorts of different phases of the game. And a guy that I found myself looking to go watch Rutgers on a weekly basis so I could see what Djabome was doing, because I knew that he was always going to be a factor. And so for me, that really jumped off the page. You know, I've compared the two before, but it reminds me of Eamon Adbonk-Miga a few years ago, and their output was quite similar as well, but a guy where I felt like I was looking to go watch his games so I could see what he was doing as a defender. And that is... maybe rare is a stretch, but that is not common for me to feel that way. And I feel like Djabome was a guy that had me going that direction.
Well, here's another kind of surprise for us. He's been on our radar for a number of years, and he is the quarterback for your Indiana Hoosiers. Curtis Rourke, the grad student quarterback at Indiana, forged an unconventional path to the Big Ten. Hailing from Oakville, Ontario, Rourke initially earned accolades at Ohio before transferring to Bloomington, where his poised leadership and consistent performance ignited a dazzling 2024 campaign. Under his guidance, the Hoosiers surged to an 11-1 regular season record. It's, get this, their best winning percentage since 1945, along with posting their first +10 win season. Statistically, Rourke was a model of efficiency. He had the top quarterback rating in Division I, and PFF ranked him as the top passer. His calm decision-making in critical moments and improved mobility behind center kept defenses guessing. Capping off his stellar season, Rourke earned second-team All-Big Ten honors, finished 9th in Heisman Trophy voting, and was recognized as a finalist for the Manning Award. In short, Curtis Rourke's 2024 performance not only elevated the Hoosiers to rarefied air, it cemented his own legacy as one of the nation's premier signal callers and provided him momentum heading into the NFL draft. You know, it's hard to believe that Curtis Rourke thought about ending his college career at the end of his senior year in Ohio and then jumped into the transfer portal, ended up at Indiana, and ended up ninth in Heisman voting. What a year for Curtis Rourke, and what a reset for his potential future, given what he did at Indiana, Gord.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, we've been, I mean, this show the last number of years might as well be called Rourke Gridiron Nation, with the amount that we talked about that family. I feel like we've been the biggest drum beaters for both the Rourke brothers throughout their career in college football. But I think even if you and I were having an honest moment to say that we saw this coming from Curtis Rourke this season, I think we'd be lying if we said that we did. I think he's blown all reasonable expectations out of the water. You think back to his last year at Ohio, and it was kind of tepid, right? Like he dealt with some injuries over about a year and a half, and in particular had that major knee injury that kind of sapped his mobility and forced him to try and reinvent himself as a quarterback. And last year that was pretty up and down. He always had the poise, he always had the arm talent, but he never had to really rely heavily on his arm. And frankly, going back to his older brother, Nathan in college hadn't really had to do that either, right? So there wasn't a lot of precedent for him to be an efficient, cerebral, pick apart the defense pocket passer. And what's been really cool to see is that as his brother has reinvented himself as that type of guy in the pros, Curtis has, over the course of the last couple of years, reinvented himself as that exact type of guy in the college game. And you see the Indiana offense, and you can see the faith that the Indiana coaching staff puts in Curtis Rourke to diagnose coverages properly, to put the ball in the right place. And they basically just they give him the materials and let him cook, right? And it's really impressive to see how effectively he does that. His turnover numbers are extremely low. I think it was only 4 interceptions on the season. His passer rating as a result and his PFF rating are off the charts, some of the best in the country. He's a guy that it's weird to characterize him as this, because it feels like he only took that leap this year, but he looks like the veteran super senior type guy, right? He looks like what you would expect a 6-year starter to play like, or a 6-year player as a starter to play like, and yet he really only took that leap this season in his 6th year down there. But it's been really impressive to see, and also a guy, like I said this about Djabome, but on the offensive side, a guy that's genuinely enjoyable to watch. Like, that when you tune in, you're going to see good throws, good plays from Curtis Rourke, and if he has time to set up in the pocket, he can do just about anything on the field.
He went into this year being certainly UFA material, just on the outside cusp of being UFA material. Now it's a question of what day does he go in the NFL draft? How high can this guy go in the NFL draft if somebody has a little bit of faith in him?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to say. I don't, because he's an older guy, because he's not a 1-year starter, but I do think that effectively NFL teams are going to kind of view him as a 1-year starter. And I know that's not necessarily a fair characterization, but I just feel like that's kind of the way that they're going to view it. He's also not a guy that adds a lot of value with his legs anymore. And so for those various factors, I maybe he sneaks into the back end of day one if somebody really falls in love with him. I mean, one of the things that works in his favor is I think that there are 2 clear first-round quarterbacks in this class right now, and then there's a whole bunch of murky middle. And I think Curtis falls into that, and so can potentially elevate himself with that. But one of the challenges with a guy like him, I alluded to the lack of value in terms of the ground. What that also often means is that he's not going to blow people away in that spring testing circuit that leads up the NFL draft. He's not a guy that's going to leap up draft boards for his testing, for example. He might in interviews, but he's not a guy that's going to leap up the board in terms of that. And so I have a hard time seeing him get into the first round, but it would not surprise me to see somebody take a flyer on him. For me, round 3 feels about right. When you start to get into that, most years you start to get into that kind of second wave of quarterback prospects. I think he fits nicely into that, but it's hard for me personally to see him going earlier than that for a handful of reasons.
What about our honorable mentions this year? One guy that we didn't talk nearly enough about, I feel a little guilty about this, is Rohan Jones, the tight end that moves around that formation for Montana State. He's been productive. He knows how to find the end zone with 8 touchdowns in the regular season. Another guy who was a quiet transfer that came out of Maine and found his stride.
Yeah, he very much did, and credit to him. He identified a program that had a great infrastructure for him and a good plan for him. Went in there, did his work, and now has put himself in a position where he's a key player on what is a legitimate national title contender at the FCS level. So I think it's been a perfect example of why the transfer portal is such a valuable thing for a lot of these players. And not that he wasn't necessarily enjoying himself at Maine, but he really took things to the next level. Not literally, he's still in the FCS, but he stepped up to one of the FCS's top contenders and proved that he can be one of the guys at that program. And I can only imagine with the success that they've had on the field and the environment that you see in Bozeman and in Montana, which is one of the most underrated football states in the country. I'm sure he is having an absolute blast after having made that transition, and now has, I think, worked himself into the conversation as a UFA guy that can make his mark on special teams and potentially get onto an NFL roster now.
Speaking of Montana, let's go to the other Montana where the Grizz play and look at another guy on our honorable mention list. We had him on the show earlier this year, Keelan White.
Yeah, I mean, Keelan, a very dynamic guy, has been throughout his entire career in Montana, and I think on the whole, he would probably characterize this season as a bit of a disappointment for him. This was his senior year. He was coming off of a very strong year last year, and the team on the whole was coming off a very strong year last year, going all the way to the national championship game in the FCS. And they took a bit of a step back this year. He himself, I was talking to his father a couple weeks ago, actually, Richard, and mentioned that he was dealing with some injuries himself throughout this year, including a high ankle sprain for the last 6 weeks or so of that season. So I think the fact that he was able to keep himself on the field, there was actually some talk of him shutting it down for the season, and he basically shot that down and said, no, this is my senior year. I'm going to finish it out with my guys, and I'm going to do what I can do. And so I think full credit goes to him for doing that. And, going out in this last game, finding the end zone, I think probably has to feel good. On the whole bigger picture, he's probably not super satisfied with the way this last year went, but that's the way life goes. And he's a guy that I'm confident is going to jump in and make an immediate impact in the CFL with his skill set.
One guy that's taken a next step is in Hawaii. His name's Nick Senecal, and he's been a solid wide receiver. I really like his progress there. Here's one guy that, at least for 1 year, I don't want to see in the transfer window. I want to see him sticking in Hawaii, and they've got some good quarterback prospects there too, to provide him more opportunities coming up next year.
Yeah, I mean, we haven't heard any news of transfer out for either him or either of those quarterbacks, so things seem to be shaping up pretty well for him. And of course, after a couple years ago, we've got visions of Mardner plums dancing in our heads. So we're a little bit worried about guys taking off out of Hawaii and going to find greener pastures and having them not be so green. And I think the evolution for Nick Senecal this year that has been really important for him has been that he's become more than a one-trick pony. Right. And this has occurred over the course of the season. I would say in the first couple of weeks of this season, he still kind of was that one trick pony. He was a speed athleticism guy that you put it over the top and take a shot downfield. So you would see lines like 2 catches per 95 yards out of Nick Senecal. And what we've seen evolve is that he has become more of a guy that can operate in different areas of the field and do some different things for you. And that's a guy that you now can start to talk about as a go-to guy on this offense instead of just a gadget guy. And if you're just a gadget guy in college, you're probably not going to be a legitimate pro guy. But if you're a go-to guy in college, you may still end up being a gadget guy in the pros, but it sets you up to potentially have that opportunity. Whereas I think a year ago, we weren't talking about Nick Senecal as a serious NFL prospect at all. And we were probably only really talking about him as a marginal CFL prospect at that point in time. And I think that he has improved his stock mightily by showing that he has variance in his skill set instead of just being that guy where you just go, okay, fast guy, go. Let's see how it goes. And he can still do that, but he can do other things too, and that makes him a far more useful player to whatever football team he's playing for, which I agree with you, I hope is still Hawaii next fall.
Coming up next, Canada has a national football team, and you might be surprised who's on it. And welcome back to Gridiron Nation on TSN, everyone. As we go into the off-season, we'll be covering a lot more on YouTube and in the social space. We'll be covering CFL. We'll be covering U Sports. Of course, we'll be covering the transfer window and Canadians in the NCAA. But the other part that we will be covering as we move forward is the international side. Yes, this little IFAF piece here. And one of the players in IFAF is the Canadian men's national team. And joining me now is Jesse Maddox, the coach and general manager of that squad. Jesse, good to have you with us.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
Hey, big day coming up for you this week. Thursday, you are rolling out your final roster for 2025, an international competition. Tell me about the process behind this and how you've come to the decisions that you've come to.
Yeah, we've established 6 to 8 ID camps across the country for the last 4 to 6 months. We've been putting on private workouts, accepting film, and ideally we've come to about 450, 460 guys that have, either played a university level, high level of football, men's league to NCAA to some with CFL backgrounds, right? So we're at the final stages from 450. We had our December 1st invitational, which we brought in 90 something guys to. And then kind of calculating, going back with the coaching staff, going through film, going through workouts, going through the, all the ID camps to a point where we got to get down to 45 here for our next part in this process, which we are doing so this week.
Before we go into the process and before we really look ahead at next year and what might be on the competition schedule for you, give us some highlights of who is going to be on this roster, maybe some names that people would know, at least people that follow this show would know, that would be on that squad.
Well, I think like anything, I think the two names that matter the most at this point is who's playing quarterback. It's always the biggest question I get from everybody, right? So who are the best two available quarterbacks? Who are the top, and when you narrow it down, there's probably 4 or 5 guys sitting around, but the top 2 today that we've gone through would be Michael O'Connor and Chris Merchant. So I would tell you, just to kind of give you that perspective on it, I mean, if we don't have the right guys playing quarterback, it is going to be a tough process. But we got 2 guys that have played a little bit of NCAA. They played, in the pro atmosphere, the CFL, and then obviously over in Europe for one of them. I think we got 2 of the most experienced and 2 of the best Canadian quarterbacks sitting around.
Considering that you'll have a number of European teams on your schedule, how important is it to have a guy like Merchant, the former Heck Creighton winner, by the way, at the controls for you for at least part of these games?
I think it's huge. He's been there, done it. And if anybody who knows Merchant, like he's got I've known him for years. He's got a linebacker mentality playing quarterback. He's a gamer and he brings that edge that you want, but he also has got the experience and the leadership factors to him. Obviously the Heck Creighton, and he's got a proven track record everywhere he's gone, including Europe, Western, Buffalo, etc.
I'm not sure if I've seen a quarterback with better mechanics at the U Sports level ever, and I've seen a lot of U Sports football, trust me on that one, than Michael O'Connor. A pure passer. He could do magical things throwing that football in terms of placement and finding windows. How is he different and a great change-up from Chris Merchant and vice versa?
Yeah, well, exactly that. They're both very different quarterbacks, right? Even just from their persona to their personalities. One's a little bit more calm, cool, collective. The other one's more, the leader, the jumper, the loud guy to an extent, right? So, I mean, there's that part of it. But, I mean, yeah, like Merchant's a little bit more of a two-headed horse. He brings some run game with him, his ability to do different things. As for O'Connor, he's 6'5", 230. And he's got an elite level arm. When that ball comes out, it just comes out differently than most quarterbacks coming out in Canada, right? So, I mean, you add those 2 together, we have the best of both worlds. We don't have issues at that point now. What can we and can't we do offensively? Because now we have 2 of the best and we can do whatever we want. And I think that makes us very dangerous.
Now, I understand that you're essentially the North American representative. The U.S. is not fielding a team this coming year, and you had a chance, at least you believe, to play Mexico, but Mexico was not ready to engage in a game. But European competition has been rolling now since 1985. There are some good teams in Europe from top to bottom. And more importantly, there's some good programs in Europe. These guys know each other. They've played with each other for a while. Germany is rising back up into that A pool. Once again, there will be a European Final Four in October featuring Germany, Austria, Finland, and Italy. It looks like you'll have an opportunity to play at least 3 of 4 of those teams at some point if the schedule pans out. Maybe walk us through what your expectations are in terms of a schedule starting in Easter.
Yeah, so I mean, obviously, we've been at Mexico for quite a bit of time, and unfortunately, they've decided they're not ready to kind of host a game of this caliber at the very last moment here for various reasons, and I won't get too much into it other than it is disappointing. But as much as it's disappointing, it's blossomed, a new flower, which is Italy has stepped up to potentially host us the Easter weekend, which I think is, when you look at it on the grand scale of things, I mean, going to Italy versus going to the outback of Mexico, I do think it's for a Canadian guy or Canadian players going down. I do think it's a more enjoyable trip and a memorable one. I do think it makes it a better situation for us. And then we're also getting used to, like you said, some of these European teams have been established. We've seen that at the under 20 stuff and where they've come. And I think when you bring it down to Italy hosting, we're going to get our first taste of what's next, if we get to that final stage at the end of the year.
Taking a look at the summer, you might have an opportunity to host a game in Canada. Tell us a little bit about how that is developing.
Yeah, just because of the gap between, February, April, it was like, how do we keep the boys into it? How do we keep guys going? How do we really determine the roster and where it is if we don't have something in the middle? So we were entertaining playing, a D3, D2 school, but then we've been in conversations with Team England, and I don't want to get too far ahead of it, but there is some interest in them wanting to come to Canada in September and potentially play us at Simon Fraser. So I looked at it like, Simon Fraser's got the facility. Obviously, we know the historic, the history and everything with the football program and where it's at today. And I think trying to do something there, hopefully in partnership with the alumni and the school, I think would be great for the school. It'd be great for kind of keeping that legacy going, and an opportunity to host an international game, which hasn't been done outside of the under 20 stuff. And I think that's very critical, but it also gives us time to reevaluate the roster, see where guys are at. And then kind of it gives us that last kicker before we have to go to Europe again.
Tell us about the formation of this program and how you're operating it. Certainly, Football Canada has given you the go-ahead to carry the brand forward in the international arena. But you guys are, I think the best way to put it, self-reliant in terms of how you're moving forward on this. Take people through that journey.
Yeah, I don't think people will necessarily understand that dynamic because it's not really public too hard. But yeah, we're ideally under Football Canada, but we're kind of subcontracted out to run this entity on behalf and in correspondence with standards and guidelines for Football Canada. But for the most part, we got a 3-4 team executive working behind the scenes, and ideally financially, operationally, we are self-sufficient. We're doing this on our own. We are a registered nonprofit. We are doing a lot of this work, not just football, not just operational, but I mean, it comes down to the fundraising, the sponsorships, the awareness, the social media. We're kind of doing a lot of this from the ground level up, trying to restore this team from where it was in 2011 and bringing it back. And I think, it has come a long way, but we definitely got the right people in the right room to do so. And, and Football Canada has been great with supporting us and, and their obligations to what this is. And for the most part, we got our work cut out for us, but we're excited about it.
I know by talking to the Europeans, they're charged up in terms of having a team from North America come out and essentially inject that energy of a world championship back into the flow of things internationally. It's been since 2015 that we've had a world championship. Tell me a little bit about what your expectations are going to Europe and playing in that time period of the end of October, the beginning of November against a potential European champion that could essentially provide a world title. Is this what this is all about for you?
Yeah, you know what? I think we, in the one year that we did this in 2011, I think Larry Haler was the head coach, and they had an all-star cast of U Sports coaches, Greg Marshall, Blake Nell. They finished silver to the United States, and then 15 didn't happen, COVID year, and now we're kind of where we are today. And I would say, we've won at the junior level, and I think with the amount of athletes that we have that are at the U Sports level, the NCAA level, the junior ranks all the way into the CFL, there's no reason that we can't play anyone in the world right now and compete, and especially over in Europe. And I think having the opportunity to do so is a great thing for Canada in Canadian tackle football, but also an opportunity for us to showcase where football is in Canada and how serious we are about it.
Well, now that I'm the vice president of IFAF, I have to be impartial, but at the same time, Jesse, hats off to you and your entire team in terms of showing that Canada is a global leader in this game. And I know that's one of the objectives that was
100%.
set forth by Football Canada 5 years ago. It's a bit of a heavy weight, isn't it, on your shoulders that you have to carry forward? But global leadership, I think, has its benefits, doesn't it?
It does, 100%. And I mean, there is a lot of work going on. There's financial obligations. There's a lot of time and hours going into this. But you know what? To do something you love for an opportunity to represent your country, I think is, it's one of those things that's a once in a lifetime opportunity. And I think bringing gold to Canada or, being the number one team, I think that would be it'd be pretty cool, and I think it'd be great, especially after winning gold with the juniors. It'd be a nice way to cap off where Canada is. And hopefully, we can do that by hopefully going to Germany, Austria, or one of those 4 teams and competing at the highest level.
Jesse, thanks very much for this. Best of luck as you move forward, and we look to many more announcements from the Canadian men's national team.
I appreciate it, and pleasure's mine.
When we come back, Games of the Week. Welcome back to the nation one more time this year for you, Gord. Games of the Week, roll.
Well, we gotta talk about the 2 Canadians in the playoffs, right? And in particular, the one this upcoming weekend is Indiana at Notre Dame. And I mentioned this on last week's program, but of the first round matchups, this one's my favorite. It's one of the few matchups in this opening round that has a little bit of rapport between the 2 teams. Indiana and Notre Dame, obviously Notre Dame's not in a conference, so they're not in the same conference, but they do share the same state. They consistently go up against each other in recruiting battles. They have a lengthy history of playing each other in non-conference play. I would suggest that there will be a pretty decent contingent of Indiana fans in the building as well. Hopefully at least some of them that were Indiana fans before this season. But I think Indiana has a legitimate chance to win this game. If I'm a betting man, which I'm not really, but I don't know that I would be betting on Indiana in this game overall, but I do think they have a good chance. And what's going to be crucial for them is, have they learned from the Ohio State game? And this applies in a number of different ways. I think that the headspace of these Indiana players needs to have learned from that Ohio State game, right? You look at the core of this team, a lot of the key players on this team came from James Madison, where Curt Cignetti came from. Nathan Rourke stepped up for mid-major. There aren't a lot of guys on this roster who are bona fide and have that experience at the Power 5, Power 4, Power 2, whatever it is now, level, to have gone into an Ohio State and know how to play that before. So that was a first for a lot of these guys. If they can learn from that quickly and go into Notre Dame, which isn't going to be quite as intense as Ohio State, and be able to perform under that pressure, I think that then they have a lot of opportunities here. But a couple things in specific that need to be cleared up. I think that Curt Cignetti as a coach, a guy that presents himself as an aggressive guy and has been for most of the season, I think that he kind of fell out of that and was a little bit more passive in that Ohio State game. I think he needs to go in with a win at all costs, go for it mentality from the outset, no matter what. And I think that they need to figure out how to protect Curtis Rourke up front. They might need to be creative to support that offensive line and have them hold up, but I also don't think Notre Dame is quite as fearsome as Ohio State on the defensive front either. So I think there are some opportunities there, and then they need to figure out how to get by Notre Dame so they can go and play Georgia, who might have 2 or 3 first-round NFL draft picks on the defensive line. But that's a conversation for a later day. At this point in time, they need to go across the state, go into South Bend, and figure out how to win. It should be a really good game. I think they have a legitimate opportunity here, and so that bodes well for them. They're the only team in action in the FBS this weekend. We should talk about Montana State, and our guy Rohan Jones that we talked about earlier on in the show has now missed their first 2 playoff games with an injury. There was some talk that he might be able to go this week. He did work out pre-game and then ultimately was not able to do it. So that seems to point in the direction of him being back for their next matchup here. They're holding the number 1 seeds. And it's funny, Jim, FCS, these states you don't typically think of as football states, but the FCS is absolutely dominated these days by Montana and the Dakotas. And sure enough, that's what we're at here. Is we've got left over in the bracket North Dakota State, South Dakota State, the University of South Dakota, and Montana State. And so things are probably going to go through the Mountain West region, if you will, to get to a national championship. Here's hoping Rohan Jones is back and helping Montana State get to the next round this weekend.
So, on Monday, we will announce online the winner of the Cornish Trophy. Keep your eyes peeled for that on socials. And all through this winter and into the spring, we will have a presence. We're not shutting it down like we normally do. We will be there for you to follow college football from a Canadian perspective. For everyone on Gridiron Nation, this is Jim Mullin saying, let's get out to the game.